Hey everybody, I'm Joe Riley. I'm the library director. Up here is a QR code that links you to our LibGuide. We've just started it. We're going to be filling it out more and more with more reliable information resources. That's number one. We know that campus SGA is going to be doing some fundraising and sort of donation stuff probably next week. I've heard that as well. Just so you know, from the library world and point of view, we are working in close contact with the Ukrainian Library Association, with the president and all of them. And on my team, we had a quick team meeting yesterday, and we wanted you all to know that it's quite serious. The president is from a library called the Igor Sikorsky Polytechnic Institute, a small college kind of like this one, named after an immigrant who settled in Eastern Connecticut and started a little helicopter company called Sikorsky. And we're in close contact with them every single day. They need our support and endorsement. There's going to be a lot of information needs. Libraries and librarians tend to be pretty good at helping with credible information and with dealing with fake news and stuff like that. So we will continue posting, but anytime any of the student organizations need space to do fundraising for this in particular, the library will give you table space and anything else that you need. So just be in touch with us and we'll say yes to it. Anyway, that's all for now. We have some fabulous speakers. Thank you all so much for coming and supporting the people of Ukraine. We stand with Ukraine.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate it.
See you, Andre.
Yeah, thanks again. Have a good time.
Yeah.
Okay, why don't we get started? Welcome, all of you. I'm very happy to see so many of you here. I don't think I've ever seen this room as full as it is now. And so I do applaud you all for being here and for having an interest on a very, very important event, which on the surface may seem to affect very few of us personally, maybe, but I can tell you one thing, the way the world works today, this is going to impact all of us in some manner. So, this is a panel discussion. What we are going to do is introduce the topic for you. I'll be doing that for about 8 minutes, 9 minutes or so. I'll give you the basics of what's happening, a little bit of historical context. Then I'm going to open it up to Professors Andrei Blazinski and Mark Malusky. They know a lot about this subject, not only because of their own personal experiences with Ukraine and Eastern Europe and Russia, but also because they've studied this topic for a long time. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rafael Fierro. I teach history and government at Tunxis. And, you know, in my U.S. since 1945 class, I haven't taught in a while, but when I do, we talk about the Cold War and the post-Cold War environment and how that situation has directly impacted what's happening in Ukraine today. So I will give you the basics. We'll move on to Professors Blazinski and Malusky. And after that, we'll open it up to questions or comments from all of you. Okay. So first of all, as you all know, there's been a Russian incursion into Ukraine. And when the operation first happened, this is basically what the map of Ukraine looked like. You can see from the northern side and the eastern and southern side, the Russian troops were coming in. About 190,000 strong were amassed at the Ukrainian border from all of those sides. They also used the northern country of Belarus, which is not pictured on that map, to enter into Ukrainian space. And so obviously tens of thousands, nearly 200,000 Russian troops can have quite an impact. And make no mistake about it, this was an invasion which has led now to a war. But if you just look at that map alone, it doesn't reveal the full story. Just like history itself, you really need to step back from it to know what's going on, to get the full picture. So this is a map of what this part of the world looked like in 1990, just as the Cold War was about to end. You can see that the Soviet Union, which not only was a nation state, but an empire, took control of much of this part of the world, Eastern Europe included. That's all in red. And so the countries of Belarus, Ukraine, and Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan didn't exist prior to 1990. They were just swallowed up by the Soviet Union in this empire. But the Cold War ended in 1990-91, and when it did, those countries gained independence. Those people gained independence. And so if you look at a map of Europe and Asia today, it's far different than it was, right? Many more independent states, some of which have aligned with Russia, and you'll notice on that map to the right that Russia is the largest entity of the former Soviet Union. But at the same time, it's much smaller than the Soviet Empire was, right? And these other countries on its border now, Russia has kind of a mixed bag with them. On the one hand, you have Belarus, which is aligned with Russia politically. But on the other hand, you have Ukraine, which has had a very turbulent relationship with Russia, as we'll see in a minute. But this brings us to the Cold War. In my US Since 45 class, we give a standard definition of what the Cold War was. It was a 45-year ideological and military conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union and their allies, although they were the two principal actors involved. They battled over land and spheres of influence, but it also eventually involved a nuclear arms race, which makes this crisis now a lot scarier to all of us, right? The possibility of escalation is with us. Now, also factored into this equation of the end of the Cold War is the principal actor involved here, and that's Vladimir Putin. Tell us how you really feel. So here's Putin. I was actually going to wear a black coat and a red maroon tie today, but then I realized this is what he's pictured, and I didn't want to affiliate myself with him, so I decided on a blue shirt and black tie. But Putin is an interesting character, right? He's a former KGB member, the Soviet spy network that dates all the way back to the 1980s and 90s, affiliated with the KGB. When the Soviet Union collapsed and the end of the Cold War came, he considered this the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. These are Putin's words. And so, ever since the end of the Cold War, Putin, in one way or another, has been looking to reclaim some of that influence and some of that land. That's his modus operandi. Not only is he looking to expand Russian influence, to get back that territory, to push westward, but he's also very hostile to the West. And he's also very hostile to democracy. In other words, he's an autocrat. He's an authoritarian ruler who does not believe in some of the liberties that we cherish and perhaps even take for granted in our country today. And perhaps most fearful of all, word is out, according to some experts, Western experts principally, he may be a bit unhinged. He's isolated himself over the last couple of years, especially since COVID. He has surrounded himself with what are called yes men. They only tell him what he wants to hear. That's never a good place to be when you're running a country. And at the same time, he may be unstable. So you take all of those things together and you have a very dangerous man. Certainly from the perspective of the West, he's dangerous. Well, from his perspective, because we do need to take into account his thoughts about this, what he's most threatened by is this organization, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, established in 1949. It was a military defense shield over Europe, specifically Western Europe, during the Cold War, because NATO was most concerned about the spread of communism westward. Nations like Italy, France, Britain, and the United States as well formed this defense pact as an effort to stop the spread of communism. Now today, if you notice from the bottom map, or at least from 2015, NATO has expanded eastward, the very thing that Putin has dreaded. Today, NATO consists of a 30-member organization. And there have been overtures from NATO to bring Ukraine into that. And Putin, of course, felt directly threatened by that, right? He's very concerned about Ukraine joining NATO, becoming westernized, as he has said. And one of the ironies of all of this is that now other nations are thinking of joining NATO, considering Putin's actions, especially Finland and Sweden. That's the latest conversation. The other X factor in all of this is China. I don't want to spend too much time on China because we could talk for a long time about it. But China has rhetorically at least aligned with Russia, which also makes this of greater concern to the world. China is not our friend, not necessarily our foe in all matters. We engage in economic trade. We have a partnership with them on some level. But China has proclaimed that this whole entire conflict is America's fault and the West's fault for encroaching upon Eastern Europe. So it blames the United States for much of the conflict. Not only that, as we probably all know, China has a very large military and an expanding economy. And, you know, there are things that China can do to cause a lot of instability for the United States and the West, especially since it has aligned itself in some way with Russia. Now, how has the West responded to Russia's incursion into Ukraine over this kind of geopolitical situation? First of all, it has sent weapons and supplies to the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky. You may have seen his face over the last few days, by the way. I'm sure most of us never knew who he was or could name him, picture him, but he's become kind of a household name and a hero because of the fact that he's refused to leave Ukraine. The United States even offered to export him out of his country, and he said very famously, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. And so the West has brought money, or is in the process of bringing money and weapons to him and his forces, to the extent that they can, battle against the Russians. Far superior army remains an open question. It's only been less than a week. The West has also responded with economic sanctions to block financial transactions and monies to Russia and going out of Russia. This is an effort to squeeze Russia in economically and financially without resorting to military pressure, military activity. I would say maybe the most interesting part of all this are the protests that have generated around the world, in the Western world especially. There's been a great deal, more than I anticipated, of solidarity with the Ukrainian people. And I think that wouldn't be possible in an era before social media, not to the extent that it has happened and how quickly it's all happened. So to me, that solidarity has been something that Putin probably underestimated, although I'm sure the speakers here will say a bit more about that. So social media has been quite an asset, I would argue, to the Ukrainian people. That's why the Russian government has tried to restrict Twitter use and other social media inside Russia. If you are in Russia, you have a far different view of what's happening here. Trust me, right? What I'm saying here would have been considered in Russia tantamount to treason. It's very different. So what comes next? Well, Putin has threatened to expand the war. Just yesterday, I believe it was, his foreign minister, Lavrov, has said that the West, if it decides to go in with military force, risks a worldwide nuclear war. And so the stakes are much higher than simply what's happening in Ukraine, although Ukraine is the linchpin that is, kind of holding this all together and pulling this all together. Also, China's role. What's China going to do next? Will its support of Russia be more than rhetorical? That's an open question. Will sanctions continue, and will they intensify? There's lots more that the West can do to financially shut out Russia. Will it take advantage of that? And of course, perhaps the most important question is, will troops be brought in to create a wider war? So that's what I wanted to set up for our two speakers today. I also want to note that Professor Frank Cohn is here, and he's going to lend a few minutes maybe of his military experience and his military history background to give us another perspective. So these are some of the images that have been coming out of Ukraine, and all of us, I think, have become familiar with them in some way. So our speakers, Professor Mark Maluski is a professor of business here at Tunxis. He's been here quite a few years. Great professor. I love hearing him talk about Ukraine. He's a wealth of knowledge. He's also known for climbing Mount Everest, by the way. I don't know if you knew that, but that's, I suppose, his claim to fame outside of Tunxis. And then, of course, we have Professor Andrei Blazinski, who has not climbed Mount Everest. He someday hopes to, but he's every bit as much a fountain of knowledge as anyone I know here. Where did I get the picture of Mount Everest? It's everywhere. So I give the floor now to the two speakers, and I don't know who wants to begin first, but it's your call, gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being here. I have 10 minutes of prepared remarks, and these views are purely my own and not representing any organization. What's the right thing for the West to do when it comes to Ukraine? What is the right thing to do? I hold a position that is firmly outside of the current policymaking mainstream. That is, I believe NATO should act. With United Nations approval, NATO should provide logistical, air, and naval support to Ukraine. Everything short of putting boots on the ground. If NATO does not act now, Putin will be emboldened to conquer other countries in the future, maybe even NATO countries. Why do I hold such an aggressive position? Because I study Russian history, and I know Polish history. I will try to explain what is happening in Ukraine today by looking at Russian and indirectly Polish history. I'm going to share a personal story which will help illuminate how Russian realpolitik works. At 4 a.m. on February 10th, 1940, in eastern Poland during World War II, a knock came on the door of my father's house. He was 9 years old, living with his mother and older brother and sister. His father was away serving as an officer with the Polish army. It was Russian soldiers and the local communist committee at the door. They told my father and his family they had 1 hour to pack. They would not be returning. They were put on a freight train to northern Russia, where they almost died. When they arrived there, they were greeted by tired and weak Ukrainians who had been deported there about 10 years earlier. 1 million Poles had been forcibly removed from their homes and deported to make room for the shifting westward of the border that Stalin was planning. When Germany started World War II by invading Poland on September 1st, 1939, what few remember is that the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east 2 weeks later. This was part of the secret agreement between Stalin and Hitler to divide Poland and share its spoils. Polish forces, facing two vastly more powerful militaries, held out for 5 weeks. The Polish underground continued to give the Germans and the Russians hell during the war. At the end of World War II, Soviet forces were on the ground in Central and Eastern Europe, and they remained there for the next 45 years. World War II did not end for Poland, East Germany, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Hungary, and all the countries behind the Iron Curtain until the end of the Cold War in 1989 and the years following. When Russia wants something, it takes it. Ukraine and Russia share a common heritage in Kievan Rus, which thrived in the years 879 to 1240. The Mongol invasion wiped out this period of history. The single defining event in Russian history is its conquest by the Mongol Horde in the 1200s and its subjugation by the Mongols for 200 years. During this time, the Mongols would arrive annually, demanding a very high tribute payment. If the village paid it, the Mongols would go away for another year. If the village didn't, the result was rape, pillage, torture, and probably the burning of the village and the killing of everyone in it. The village leaders, who oppressed their people in order to save them, ultimately became personally rich, threw off Mongol domination, became Russian princes, and ultimately the Russian Tsar, a dictator, came from this group. The Russian state was not born out of Enlightenment principles of freedom, democracy, self-determination, and the pursuit of happiness as in the United States. From the Mongol experience and other experiences to come, Russian leaders learned to fear foreigners, avoid weakness, value strength, respect power, and accept the domination of all individuals to the service of the state. This was true for the Tsar, for the Communist Politburo, and for Putin today. Putin is not interested in the Western system of free market economics and democracy. Putin couldn't care less about the national sovereignty of other countries. Putin wants a strong Russian state protected from the outside world. This means a sphere of influence between Russia and its neighbors controlled by Moscow. This means a Russian empire. At the least, this sphere of influence includes Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. In the future, it may also include Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, and Transnistria, or some variety of this. What should the West do? Whatever actions the West took in reaction to Putin's land grabs in Georgia in 2008 and in the eastern and Crimean parts of Ukraine in 2014 were ineffective. Sanctions will not stop Putin from taking over Ukraine. Russia only understands power. Russian military forces in Ukraine, including the Crimea, must be driven out or destroyed now. Russia is in violation of international law, namely the United Nations Charter. Quote, all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, end quote. The NATO border must be fortified. NATO's footprint must be increased significantly with permanent NATO troop deployments in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. Financial assets of Putin and Russian oligarchs held in Western banks must be seized. Europe must end its dependence on Russian gas. A tricky business in that we must keep in mind the world faces another crisis, climate change. Finally, the United States must strengthen its democracy at home. The bruising in Iraq and Afghanistan, the 2008 financial crisis, mass shootings, racial tension, hyper-political partisanship, Donald Trump's love affair with North Korea's Kim Jong-un and Russia's Vladimir Putin, Trump's criticism of U.S. allies and international organizations such as the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and NATO, and his falsehoods about the 2020 presidential election have not looked to the world like a model of democracy that they would like to follow. Actions like these show weakness to our adversaries. Putin wants to rebuild the Russian Empire. He hopes this will distract the Russian people from their own economic hardship and political repression and to theoretically keep Russia safe. The call to nationalism is made easier by the fact that in Russia today there is no freedom of the press, no free speech, no free political system, and no independent courts. The economy is directed by the Kremlin and run by a handful of billionaires, the so-called oligarchs, all close friends of Vladimir Putin. The only truly efficient government institution in Russia today is the security apparatus, which has been true throughout Russian history. Long term, the Russian people will tire of the repression, corruption, and inequality as they did during the Russian Revolution and at the end of the Cold War. This system will collapse or be overthrown, and the potential for reform will be at hand. Putin will do his best to see this does not happen in his lifetime, though it is difficult to tell what dangers lurk for Putin within the Kremlin. Ultimately, this is a struggle between two different value systems: democracy versus dictatorship, freedom versus repression, the rule of law versus the rule of one man. The Ukrainians have chosen the Western path and are demonstrating this valiantly. Will the West help Ukraine in the way that it is really needed?
Okay, can you hear me? Yes? Okay. All right, just a few historical notes first. When in 1991 the Soviet Union fell apart and Ukraine declared independence, it inherited the world's third largest nuclear arsenal. In '94, the Clinton administration helped forge an agreement called the Budapest Memorandum, by which Ukraine gave up these weapons in exchange for guarantees of their sovereignty and territorial integrity by the other signatories of the agreement: Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Today, our government claims these commitments were not legally binding. So I guess that we're just kidding. In 2008, in the last months of the G.W. Bush administration, Russia invaded the country of Georgia in the Caucasus, and President Bush imposed economic sanctions on Russia. But only a few months later, the newly inaugurated President Obama initiated his policy of reset of our relations with Russia. Hillary Clinton famously handed a red reset button to Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and Russian troops in Georgia didn't seem to matter much. Today, we're talking about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, slated to move Russian natural gas to Germany, bypassing all other countries, especially Ukraine. But in the Obama administration, Nord Stream 1, completed in 2012, had already accomplished the same. Nord Stream 2 takes the same route and would simply double the volume. In 2014, Russia invaded the Crimea and Donbas regions of Ukraine, annexing Crimea and installing a protracted war in Donbas. President Obama imposed sanctions on some of Putin's friends, but refused to share intelligence and send any weapons to Ukraine. In 2017, Donald Trump finally did start sending arms to Ukraine. And in 2019, he did act to stop the completion of Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Now in 2021, Biden reversed Trump's sanctions and green-lighted Nord Stream 2, while canceling the Keystone pipeline from Canada to the United States and curtailing American fossil fuel production. The U.S. went from energy independence and being a net exporter of energy to dependence on Russian oil. Now, why does Ukraine matter? A popular declaration these days is, why should we risk American lives or treasure in a place or country that most Americans couldn't even find on a map? Of course, most Americans couldn't find Arkansas on a map either. And one may ask how many people would find Pearl Harbor before December 7, 41. Even more disturbing is our citizens' gross ignorance of history, so that many don't even know the significance of that date. Yet knowledge of history is indispensable to even begin to understand the national interest of any country and calculating what is worth risking for anything, of anything. If we consider history, we might begin to appreciate how appeasing a homicidal maniac like Putin might not lead to the best outcomes. Instead of securing peace, it only stimulates his appetite for more. Another lesson from history for those who actually pay attention to world events is that when a superpower such as the United States acts or fails to act regarding a major conflict or issue, it tends to cause significant ripple effects throughout the world. The American exit from Vietnam led to an extended period of Soviet and Cuban adventurism and interventions in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, including the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in '79. Our invasion of Iraq, ostensibly because of Saddam's nuclear weapons, led Mr. Gaddafi in Libya to surrender his nukes, which we didn't even know he had. And it also led the Iranians to suspend the nuclear program. That's without the agreement. More recently, our disastrous and shameful retreat from Afghanistan has only confirmed doubts about our will to support our allies and resolve to defend our interests and civilization. In addition to history, a knowledge of economics would be helpful in understanding what matters. Looking at the United States, international trade has been a critical factor in our economic growth throughout our history. But international commerce requires open trade routes, conditions of general peace, and a rules-based world order. Most people take for granted the post-World War II peace in Europe and security of other nations in other parts of the world. And consequently, they grossly underestimate the importance of this peace and security in creating the unprecedented expansion of prosperity it fostered. While Ukraine is an important country in terms of its people and resources, in itself, it is not indispensable to our security and prosperity. But preventing or stopping Russian aggression and conquest of Ukraine is absolutely critical to our security and prosperity. So the question is, how did we get to be so stupid? The ignorance of average citizens regarding history and their focus on their own lives instead of global political issues is understandable. However, it is a very different matter when it comes to our elites, and especially people who aspire to leadership and the presidency. They should strive to be better informed, better educated, and more astute. They should pay attention to those ripple effects of our action or lack of action. They should lead and be able to explain to the nation why Ukraine or Afghanistan or the Baltic countries or Taiwan are important to us. Unfortunately, most seem woefully deficit in the requisite knowledge and or intellect. Part of the problem is that American presidents lack any basis in their own experience to imagine the mindset of a KGB officer like Putin, or a mass murderer like Stalin or Mao, and their imitators like Xi Jinping. Consequently, our leaders often assume they can contain the beast through international agreements and institutions, charm offensives, or appeasement. Such extreme naivete seems to be a recurring affliction among American presidents. But another explanation is that some of our leaders may be willfully ignorant for domestic political reasons. Biden's energy policy is a case in point. Implementing environmental extremist policy, Biden has reduced U.S. fossil fuel production and canceled U.S. support for the East Mediterranean natural gas project. His policy makes it impossible to impose the most significant economic sanction targeting Russian energy exports, while doing nothing to reduce carbon emissions. These policies only shift fossil fuel production from the United States and the Eastern Mediterranean to Russia and Iran. While Putin is killing civilians in Ukraine, John Kerry has expressed concern that the war in Ukraine might cause Russia to renege on its climate change commitments. What he doesn't seem to realize is that the rulers in Russia and China, as well as China, look upon Kerry and our climate change focus with disdain and derision, making promises to do something in the far distant future while taking advantage of our climate obsession in the present. So what about economic sanctions? Well, economic sanctions rarely actually cause the targeted country to change its action or policies. It does happen, but not that often. And in the case of Putin, we must recognize that his cost-benefit calculation is not in terms of economic gain or loss, but in terms of power, sheer power. In this regard, we should not underestimate Putin's willingness to allow his nation to suffer, nor should we underestimate the Russian nation's capacity for suffering economic misery for the sake of empire and Mother Russia. The only sanctions that may change the situation are those that impact significantly and directly Putin's ability to conduct his war and occupation of Ukraine. And there are only two sanctions that come close to having such an impact. One is excluding Russia from the SWIFT dollar-based bank payment system, and the other one is boycott of Russian energy exports. Excluding Russia from the SWIFT system will impose serious costs by making it very difficult for Russia to conduct international trade and payments. However, it will also make it difficult to pay for Russian gas and receive payments for exports to Russia, which is probably why currently we are not implementing this sanction comprehensively, limiting greatly its impact. Moreover, in the mid to long term, Russia may redirect a portion of its trade to China and use an alternate payment system based in the Chinese yuan, a system that Russia and China have been working on setting up for some time now. As the economic heft of China grows, there is some risk in using denial of access to the dollar-based SWIFT system. Ultimately, it undermines the role of the dollar and our banks in international trade and finance. Senator McCain once joked that Russia was a gas station with nuclear weapons. Indeed, fossil fuels constitute up to 40% of Russian exports. So the most significant sanction would be to deny Russia the source of hard currency, this source of hard currency. This sanction could seriously impact Russia's economy and ability to pursue aggression. Even a drastic reduction in the price of oil would have an impact bigger than most other sanctions. However, this sanction is problematic because of the dependence of Germany and other European powers on other European countries on imported Russian gas. Worse, even the US is importing oil from Russia. Europe does have some reserves as well as significant capacity to import liquid natural gas shipped by sea. But the key factor to sustain this section of boycotting Russian oil and gas is increased production by the United States, along with tapping the East Mediterranean natural gas. President Biden would have to reverse his policies. So for now, Putin can feel secure about his fossil fuel exports and his aggression. So what should we do right now? Well, for one thing, we should in fact do our utmost to assist the Ukrainians in their fight right now. And that includes provide anti-aircraft Stinger missiles and anti-tank Javelin missiles and small arms ammunition to the Ukrainian army. Also provide communications and other equipment and medical supplies to the insurgency. and provide medical supplies, food, and essential goods to the civilian population and refugees. That is the first thing we should do. Secondly, we should inform the Russian public. We should do our utmost to make sure that Russian people know what's going on, what's really going on, and what Putin is up to. The lack of success on the battlefield and glaring shortcomings of the Russian forces in logistics and morale have put Putin's reputation on the line, and possibly even his survival. So we should help to ease him off his pedestal. Number 3, we should reverse United States energy policy. Nothing will signal our resolve better than the decision to do that. American fossil fuel production should be increased. We should reinstate support for the East Mediterranean natural gas pipeline. We might even prevail on the Saudis and the Gulf countries to increase their production, assuming we reverse our policy, which is pro-Iranian and anti-Arab right now. These steps will make possible the economic sanction that can truly devastate the Russian economy, free Europe from potential Russian economic blackmail, and seriously impair Putin's ability to wage war. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline will become a moot issue. We might also ask the German politicians to stop shooting themselves in the foot by eliminating nuclear from their energy mix. Other sanctions, well, we should exclude all Russian banks, not just some, from the SWIFT system, and go full bore after Putin personally and all of his cronies. But most importantly, we should make the removal of all sanctions contingent on total withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukrainian territory and Russian recognition of Ukraine's sovereignty, including its right to join NATO if it wants to. Number 5, we should announce plans to revive and strengthen the missile defense system in East Europe, which will significantly improve European security. 6, we should move military assets eastward. Start talking about moving significant U.S. military assets eastward, possibly a naval base in Romania on the Black Sea, and in Estonia or Lithuania right next door to Kaliningrad on the Baltic. Move some of the military installations in Germany to Poland. And then finally 7, NATO expansion. Yes, I had this point before the announcement was made that Finland and Sweden were actually interested. But yes, we should invite Finland and Sweden to join NATO. That would certainly get Putin's attention, though Germany's recent reversal on some of their policies probably already got that. Now, final point. All these steps should have been considered, threatened, or implemented leading up to the Russian invasion, because that could have, in fact, possibly prevented it, especially if, in fact, we gave the Ukrainians some more advanced systems like Patriot surface-to-air missiles and Harpoon anti-ship missiles. That would have definitely changed the balance of power and affected the situation. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Quite informative. I would suggest that they both agree that Putin is a monster and that he ought to be removed from power, but you may have noticed there's some disagreement as to where the responsibility of the United States lies, and maybe we could have some questions and comments directed at that. In other words, what should the United States do? What should it have done? But before I do that, I would like to invite Professor Cohn to come up here, because we're going to enlist his expertise in military history, and a couple of minutes, and then we'll open it up to your questions and comments. Dr. Cohn.
Thank you. I'm sort of underdressed for this event, but I actually do have it's sort of blue and yellow. I didn't plan it that way. I think you did. I don't have any prepared remarks, but I've certainly been following this invasion with interest, and obviously with a lot of sympathy for the good guys. And there are good guys and bad guys in life. There is evil and there is good, and I think we see it here pretty clearly. So this is the biggest military operation in European history since World War II, and it's the biggest Russian military operation since World War II, and we're seeing the effects of that. The Russian military is not good. You know, they have all sorts of problems. It's largely a conscript army, and if you know anything about how the conscripts are treated, it's horrible. They don't want to be there. They're mistreated. They're not paid well. Morale is terrible. Logistics has never been a Russian strong point. And you hear the stories of them running out of fuel and food, and it's nothing new. The same thing happened in Chechnya. It's happened in other places, too. So what you have really is an enormous, ponderous, blunt instrument. That's what the Russian military is. And it can't get out of its own way right now. But my fear is, over time, they're going to use that blunt instrument. And we're already seeing that happen. The one thing they can do is destroy things using firepower. And that, if they're going to prevail here, that's how they're going to prevail. It's not going to be through nuance. It's not going to be through maneuver. It's going to be that way. And I fear that's what's going to happen. Chechnya, you can read about that. Grozny, see what happened there. Even in Syria, where they've intervened with mercenaries, they're really relying on firepower to do the job. So can the Ukrainian military withstand this indefinitely? They can't. There's no way. We certainly do have to resupply them constantly. But the fear is if the Russians gain control, aerial superiority, if they cut the land links to the bordering countries, at some point, resupply is going to be difficult or impossible. And at that point, they're going to be facing what the Finns faced, if you know that story. The Russians invading Finland in 1939. The Finnish military really proving to be far superior. But ultimately, the Russians prevailed really through brute force. Now, Finland was lucky in that they retained a country, although they lost a lot of territory, and they lost a lot of lives, too. So I do agree with Professor Malusky, well, at least in this respect. If NATO does not intervene, unless we think sanctions are going to cripple the Russian economy to the extent that the war cannot be continued and or Putin is toppled from power, the Ukrainians are going to lose. It's just going to be a matter of time. So the question really becomes, what is the United States and NATO willing to do? Are they willing to escalate this militarily? To what extent, and what would that look like? And that's the choice I think leaders are going to be facing. And really, they're facing it now, and they're going to be facing it soon. Because long term, I have tremendous admiration for the Ukrainian military. The incursions in 2014, the Ukrainian military was useless. They had only a handful of professional soldiers. Corruption was rife. They put up almost no resistance Crimea. The Donbass was a complicated factor because there was elements of civil war there, too, to some extent. But what we see in the intervening years is the effects of a couple of things. One is training by the United States and NATO allies of their military and arming them. And the other thing certainly we see is this nation at arms, this appeal to nationalism, patriotism, which gives their military tremendous resilience. But again, the Finns had that too. And the Finns did not prevail. And I fear that Ukrainian long-term, if this war goes on, they cannot prevail either without more assistance from the West. So the question becomes, what is the West willing to do? What is it willing to risk? And I'm still pondering that in my head, what should be done. But of course, I'm nobody, I'm not in charge. Thank you.
I disagree. He's not nobody. He knows a lot of what he's talking about. So thank you, Dr. Cohn, for those comments as well. What I'd like to do now is open it up to questions and comments. I just ask two things: that you use the microphone that I'm going to be passing around, and that you make your comments or questions clear and quick, so that way we can move on to the next. I have a feeling there are going to be quite a few. So does anyone want to begin the discussion? Judy.
So I don't remember exactly which one of you mentioned it, but the UN, an agreement was made, I believe, for no nation to attack any other sovereign nation. And therefore, Ukraine is a sovereign nation, so could not the UN send troops, the United States and all the other countries that provide troops? Could the UN not, isn't it able to send troops into Ukraine to protect based on that criteria?
UN forces are mostly peacekeeping forces. They're not really offensive forces, but what countries often do will go to the UN, pass a resolution authorizing force, and then an organization like NATO could go in and make something happen. So, of course, this happens all the time in international affairs. Borders are violated and nothing happens. So there's an element of unfairness in this to other nations who are not getting the attention that Ukraine's getting. Nonetheless, because of the power of Russia, the size of its military, and the consequences of inaction, and its track record of taking over other nations, this is in an area by itself. So probably what you might see, I mean, this is what the United States did before the Iraq War. They went to the United Nations. They made a case for armed intervention, and the UN endorsed it. It was the famous Colin Powell speech, and U.S. forces went in. So it probably wouldn't be United Nations blue helmets, as they're called. They wear UN blue helmets. Maybe they would be there as peacekeepers afterwards. It is interesting that you could say Putin went into Ukraine saying, we're going in as peacekeepers. We could go into Ukraine and say, we're peacekeepers.
Good point.
There is another issue, and that is that the Soviet Union, or Russia actually now, has a veto power over the UN Security Council decisions. So in other words, such a move by the United Nations is simply not possible.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, sir.
Yeah, so if in theory China did choose to make their take literal place with Russia, take the side of Russia in this issue, and we did enforce any or all these sanctions that you were speaking of, would that kind of nullify it? Because China is just such a large country with such a great population, and it has so much of the manufacturing power, and so many things come from China that even if we did put all these restrictions on Russia, couldn't they just, and if China's their ally, couldn't they just, supply them with everything they pretty much needed, and in turn import the oil from Russia, which they have so many people that they make a good amount of money from it?
Yes, the position of China in this situation is indeed important, okay, because indeed Russia could redirect its trade. They could send gas and oil to China instead of the West. The only thing is that would take a little time, and the other thing is that I'm not so sure that the Russians would be that thrilled to be that dependent on China. Long term, that denying them hard currency as opposed to rather soft currency, which is the Chinese, does matter, and it's going to matter for a while. So down the road, yes, that alliance between Russia and China is extremely, extremely troubling for us. But right now, it's still effective. If we had, our sanctions would still be have a significant impact on Russia.
China is important here. I looked at my notes when we had a panel in 2014, and Russian trade was much more with Europe at that time. And since 2014, they have shifted more trade toward China, especially since now the West is cutting Russia off from financial resources. It could look to China for financial resources. So China's actions could have a big influence here. Of course, while we're on the topic of China, we should mention that, of course, they're watching the Western reaction here to see how they might act in regard to Taiwan, which they very much desire. We'll see how that goes.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. The other part of that equation is that China and Russia have a long history of being foes rather than allies. And in fact, during the Cold War, the United States did try, perhaps not as much as it should, to take advantage of what was called the Sino-Soviet split. So just because they share interests geopolitically, it doesn't mean that they automatically are allied with each other. And thus far, if I'm not mistaken, I think China's support of Russia has been more rhetorical with words than anything else, although Professor Malusky is right that China and Russia see a sort of brotherhood here against the West. But there are ways to take advantage of the fact that they share a border, they don't trust each other. So I don't know that Russia relying on China for its economic success would be enough. So anyway, next question.
I listened to DW made analysis about the sanctions that was placed on Russia, right? And I realized that Russia had a sanction placed on a central bank, right? And the central bank has a foreign reserve of $630 billion, which out of that, 40% of it is outside Russia. So that is the only amount that the West can have. Now, Russia also has about over $140 billion in debt on the Chinese market alone. So that one alone can I believe that with the $40 billion they have with China in debt, they can rely on China to easing the impact of the sanction. So my question is there any way we can have the West or NATO can have China to get on board with these sanctions?
Good question, and also very good command of those numbers.
Yeah,
that's very good.
Now, China is definitely not going to be involved with sanctions against Russia for several reasons. They've never cooperated with any such things because they consider how should I put it, it would establish a very bad precedent relative to them because they're the ones that very often have been sanctioned. So no chance of that. And secondly, I think the alliance between Russia and China is much bigger than, in fact, we are willing to admit. Okay, there's some agreements that they have which are quite far-reaching, okay? So that alliance is real. The fact that they may not necessarily love each other, that's another point.
A way to look at this is the United States is a great power in decline. China is a great power on the rise. Russia was a great power and it wants to be a great power again. The United States currently has the largest economy in the world. China has the second largest economy in the world. China's very intertwined with the world's economy. Russia, not so much. And going back to ultimately what Putin cares about, it's not economics, it's power. And I think that what really makes Putin angry and hurts Putin and makes him think is not really sanctions against Russian banks as much it is freezing assets of his and the oligarchs. Now, they're hard to get to because they're very sophisticated and they've hidden their money quite well, but a lot of it is in the West because the oligarchs love living and vacationing over here. So if we could make their lives unpleasant, crimp their style, that might be quite tempting for them to say Putin is no longer an adequate leader of Russia. And again, we do need to keep in mind the intrigue that historically has always occurred within the Kremlin. They tend to overthrow each other at times. So something could be slipped into a drink or something like that. So if you make the lives unpleasant for the oligarchs, that might be an effective part of the strategy.
Putin's also known for having poisoned some of his rivals, as you might know, and maybe a little bit of that would be some payback. Would be nice.
He's also very cautious.
Yes. He's a germaphobe, apparently, and doesn't get within many, many feet of his, even his inner circle. So we have another question here, Peter.
My question relates, is that on?
No. Oh, it is.
Oh, my question relates, we've talked a lot about the Russian people. Can we talk for a second about the American people? First of all, I agree with the panelists who said that a lot of the things we're talking about doing now, we should have done. We waited too long, it should have been a deterrent, and so we've lost a lot of our cards in the game. But are we as a people willing to take short-term the pain that the correct response on our side will cause us? And the simple thing is the price of the pumps, which could easily go up to $5 real quick. It's pushing $4. The point is the whole world is watching. We've kind of stumbled a number of times, Afghanistan. We may be in decline, but we're not declining that quick. But if we don't do the appropriate thing now, we are in decline. We only have so many chances to star, if you will. So do you think we as a people are willing to support the actions our leaders should take to end this quickly?
I don't think we as a people are prepared right now. I do think that this requires political leadership. I do think this requires educating the American public about what this is going to take and that this fight is worth taking. And I think that's, televised presidential addresses and things like that. The consequences can be quite severe for American participation in this. Let's not trivialize that. Russia does have significant cyber capabilities. There are, who knows how much they've infiltrated into the American infrastructure and things like that. Lights can be turned off. They have submarines. They can cut undersea cables. So we wake up, we don't have internet. They have nuclear weapons. Bad things can happen. I think there's a lot of bluffing going on the Russian side just to preempt any of our thinking of getting involved. That's going to happen. But during the Cold War, there's a doctrine called mutually assured destruction, MAD. We won't use our nukes, you won't use your nukes, because we both know how mutually destructive that would be. One would hope that that would still be in mind. Even if Putin is slightly unhinged, I do think that there are competent people around him, the generals. I don't think he's got the nuclear button sitting right next to his bed here, and it's as easy as him pressing it. I think there are protocols in place, and if it did get to that point, I don't think the Russian elite wants to see things escalate too badly. So that's a long way of getting around to saying that at the moment, I don't think we are prepared as a nation to give the assistance that Ukraine requires. The United States historically gets into these things kicking and screaming. We didn't want to get into World War I, finally did. Didn't want to get into World War II, finally did. Good things happened from those interventions ultimately, but it wasn't easy going, and presidents are reluctant to rally the domestic populations until compelled to do so. But I guess that's all I have to say.
Well, maybe I can add a little bit. Yeah, it is a question of leadership more than anything. And I'm sorry to say, but the current president, I don't think, is capable of actually explaining why any of this stuff is important to us. So therefore, indeed, he's incapable of bringing the nation to that point. So kind of a moot thing. As far as mutual assured destruction, Yeah, that's the policy, except for one problem. Okay, there are weapons that can kind of negate that whole thing, and the hypersonic missiles that the Soviets or the Russians are developing, and the Chinese, in fact, we as well, although we're a little behind. Okay, actually puts that into question. So I'm not so sure that we're ready to risk nuclear war with Russia. I think what we should do is do everything just short of direct intervention, simply because it's just not, I think it's not prudent. The other thing I disagree with Mark about is that the United States is a declining power. I don't think that's necessarily true. I don't think it has to be true, and I think I would disagree with that.
So, just one comment in reference to Peter's question regarding the American people, are we ready for it? The one thing that concerns me is just how polarized we are, and whether we can indeed come together as one people in the face of this external threat. And in the past, eventually we did. But we live in a very, very different society now. And for a lot of reasons, Americans seem so divided. It's almost as if there's this knee-jerk reaction that we're going to take the opposite side of, whoever the president we don't support is. Or if we support him, it doesn't matter what the opposition says, we're going to support him no matter what. And that's a dangerous place to be. And we already see signs of that division playing out in this conversation. I don't know that there's 100% support behind Biden, regardless of what he does. And conversely, if he should be, as Andre suggests, not competent enough to make the right decisions in this event, will his supporters actually call him out on that? It's not enough for the opposition to do so. We have one question here, and then I'll get to Lisa.
Hi, so kind of going off of what the gentleman over here said, I agree with your assessment that we aren't educated enough to kind of have that unified push that we need if the decision was made to have any kind of military incursion into Ukraine, which I'm assuming that that's what you're suggesting, correct? Okay. So I think when we look at history, we can turn an eye towards the Middle East as far as how to gauge the U.S. response to the Ukrainian issue at hand, right? Speaking from a geopolitical standpoint, Russia gave assistance to the Assad regime in 2011 and beyond. And the response from the Obama administration was the red line, which he allowed them to cross. And that severely impacted our ability to respond in kind, and affected how the world viewed American response towards those kinds of incursions as well. So do you think that, given that history, do you think that a military incursion into Ukraine would be at all beneficial to, through NATO or through other means, would be beneficial to the United States in any way, given that we have seen that when geopolitical and strategic issues are at hand for Russia, they take those stances far more seriously in terms of lending their troops, giving lives, military support, because Syria is their access to the Mediterranean. So that was far more valuable to the Putin regime than it was for Obama to defend the red line in the sand, essentially. And I kind of see the same similar situation here in Ukraine, where there's nothing that will benefit us, unfortunately, right? Because it is a serious humanitarian issue, crisis, and it's incredibly sad that this is occurring. But when you speak politics, we have to think of the benefits and the negatives, because it's a sort of zero-sum game in reference to that. And so do you see any benefit by us entering this conflict, militarily speaking?
I limited my remarks to saying that everything short of putting boots on the ground. So I don't think we should send in land forces, but I think we should provide air support and possibly naval support. I don't think we should go into Ukraine. If we need to go into Ukraine, we need to get out as quickly as possible. I think that I'm thinking more in lines of the first Gulf War, where shock and awe, I'm just looking at that 40-mile convoy of Russian troops and trucks and tanks just sitting there like sitting ducks. It would be a lot better for everybody if we could just take those out right now. So, yeah, I think just giving logistical support, air support. I mean, there's a couple of antiquated Russian frigates in the Black Sea. I would support also, while we're at it, take back Crimea. I think the sanctity of Ukrainian borders need to be restored. Definitely Russia, at the very least, is going to want to hold on to that southern coastal area. That needs to be taken back. I applaud the Biden administration thus far. Putting energy policy to the side for one moment, the West is united. NATO is united. And I think that we've put some very heavy-hitting sanctions in. So everything short of military invasion, I think it's been handled well thus far. There are adults in the room. I think Secretary of State Blinken is a thoughtful diplomat. It's just, will that be enough in the end? And a note on energy policy. So I would love to see the world progress to renewable energy as quickly as possible, but I'm also pragmatic. And this is Europe's fault for getting so dependent on Russian energy. But given where we are, I fully approve of United States' massive exports of liquefied natural gas to Europe to help them with their energy. And any other countries like Saudi Arabia that could help out, yes. It kills me from a climate change point of view, but that's the reality of the situation. It does need to be done. And I agree with Germany and nuclear. Yeah, I don't like nuclear waste that results, but nuclear energy is a great non-climate harming energy source. I think we should be doing more of it in the United States as well, frankly, although I don't like the nuclear waste. But so that's enough for now.
If I can add a little bit, I'm glad we agree on the shipments of natural gas, and I think we ought to have a debate about the climate change policy. But getting back to NATO and Biden, I don't believe it's Biden that united NATO, but I think it's Putin. I don't think Biden or Blinken, Clinken, whatever his name is, contributed a damn thing to that at all. The other thing is I like to argue with Raf about the divided country. You know, if you look at American history, there are periods where we were pretty much divided. For instance, the early 1800s, we were divided in terms of whether we should have a war with France or England. And yet, when it came time, we did get united. And there are other periods like that. So, you know, just because we're at each other's throats now doesn't mean that perhaps this is the very thing that could actually make that happen. Who knows?
Perhaps. So we have a few more questions at least. I'm going to open the floor to Professor Wisniewski here. She has a comment. If you need to go, I know that the 1 o'clock hour is approaching and you have classes, that's okay, but we do have a couple of announcements for those who want to stay even beyond the question and answer session. Go ahead.
So I just wanted to add a couple of comments to the conversation about unity and collective, or maybe, well, I'll just keep talking. You know, I think if we just look at our leaders of taking away the power of people, there's a lot of things that we can do as a community, as people being leaders, that we can tap into and do. A lot of the conversation right now is around cybersecurity and the cyber warfare element. We can combat that, first of all, with the knowledge of cybersecurity, but also to what Professor Fierro shared Oh, there I go. Information is key. You know, if we were in the Russian Federation right now, we would have a very different perspective of what is happening. We have a chance out in the West to share credible information. What I will ask you to do is be very mindful of what you share, be aware of the hashtags and where you're sharing from. There are certain hashtags that are malignant actors that have been created for the purpose of this cyber warfare. Okay, so please, sharing of information so that to what my colleagues have described, perhaps can sway the minds of the Russian people. They are already protesting. That is huge compared to if you look at Russian history. People in Russia are getting arrested. We need more of that. I think as we need to start looking at democracy, what that is, especially in the U.S. We are divided. Every country has significant flaws, but it is certainly a time to come together, because the only time that social movement and social change happens is when a group of people work together on a cause. The time is now. I do have a list of resources to share in the local community. I will talk about them very briefly, but if you would like a list of this with links, you could certainly email me at lwisniewski@txcc.com.edu, and I'm happy to share them. So, first resource, this Friday evening, there will be a fundraiser for Ukraine at the Belvedere Cafe and Restaurant in New Britain, Connecticut. The proceeds will go to fund medical supplies and things on the ground in Ukraine. Attorney Adrian Barron is offering his legal services for free for Ukrainian families, especially families who have decided to go back to Ukraine and fight the war. He will offer services such as preparing powers of attorney, wills, and other legal documents to protect family members at this time. The Be Strong Foundation in New York City is at the front lines at the border in Poland, and they are sending survival kits to these families who are crossing. I believe the number is now 600,000 refugees in Poland, or throughout the country. The bordering countries do need help in helping with the resources. The Be Strong Foundation is there. I believe they raised $3 million just over the weekend. Razom Foundation is also in New York City. They are also doing a very wonderful work there. They have a list of things that you can do, whether it's donating money or talking to your elected leaders. And lastly, if you know of families who are trying to cross the border into Poland, please check the Chancellery of the Prime Minister's website in Poland. It has information in Russian, Ukrainian, and Polish, I believe, for families to know, because again, a lot of the issue that's happening right now is simply misinformation to create confusion. And if we could combat a lot of that, my hope is that we can get somewhere faster. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Professor Wisniewski. She teaches sociology for us, and that was very well said, and thanks for the information.
Can I add a little bit to that? Because
yes.
First of all, the fundraiser in the Belvedere took place yesterday. The organization that I'm involved with, the Polish American Foundation, is the one that organized that. We also have made arrangements with several Ukrainian charitable organizations in Ukraine, and so we do indeed raising funds for them. All the money that we raise goes to the Ukrainians, and if you want to contribute, there are a couple of posters around, but the best thing to do is to find the Polish American Foundation on Facebook, and you can donate through that. Okay, so if you want to, it's quite a lot of money that we already gathered. The other thing is that we're also sending couriers actually with medical supplies to Poland, to the border. So if you want to support that, this is one way of doing it. There's others as well.
And if I could add one more before we get to the last set of questions. The National Bank of Ukraine has opened a special account to raise funds for the Ukrainian army. And if you want more information, I have this handout for you. Come get it. Okay, we have a question or comment back there. You're on. And then we'll bring it forward here.
In the event the economic sanctions in support of the United States and Ukraine forces
Speak a little
Russia's
louder,
hand.
please.
In the event the economic sanctions in support of the United States and Ukraine forces Russia's hand to acknowledge the Chinese yuan as an international currency in opposition of the United States dollar, what will be the global impact given Russia's share of energy sources and China's share in the international trade of export, as well as their role in many countries' debts?
An excellent question.
Well,
I don't know
the
if you
main
heard.
impact will be that it will allow Russia to conduct some business, okay? But it's not that easy, okay? Because the problem with starting another payment system like through the yuan is that if you're talking about just trade between Russia and China and Iran and a few other the pariahs in the world, that would work very well for them, but only within that crowd, okay? If you want to go beyond that, it's a problem because for a currency like the dollar to be the international currency, it requires a few other things other than just an electronic system. It also requires a legal system where disputes can be handled fairly, okay? That is absent in China. It's one of the reasons why the dollar continues to be a major currency, is because we have a decent legal system where people can, talk about their transactions and have them disputed. Also, of course, the U.S. economy is still the biggest. And so is, putting that together with the European economies and the Japanese economies, that is still a huge majority of the trade, the world trade, okay? But yeah, China is rising. So down the road, yes, it's an issue.
I love it. This is all great stuff. So just, keep me posted. Your mic is live.
Probably also the Chinese system is just not attractive to everyone else in the world as the way to the go for most parts. So adopting the yuan at the moment's probably not the direction everybody's looking in.
Thank you.
We'll try to put all those. Just put it on and you don't have to hold the button.
Library site, Sanctions.edu/Ukraine.
Thanks for having this panel discussion. I think it's been very informative. Sad to see that most of the students are already gone. I think that you've been very eloquent in describing the situation, but I think what you've really failed to do is to piss the people off. And that's what needs to be done in this situation. The Russians are committing atrocities. They are murdering people. And the information that was provided was sort of like a school environment. People should have walked out of this today pissed. And they should have walked out feeling like they are Ukrainians. Not Poles, not Americans, but Ukrainians. And they should have walked out with the intent of doing something small on their part to cause pain to the big bear. Saturday, there was a rally at the state capitol, which I attended. And I looked around, and I saw the towers that are adjacent to the Capitol. And I reflected upon the fact that I remember as a 10-year-old boy standing there with my father protesting against Russian atrocities. Only at that time, it was against the Polish people and against the Estonians and against the Latvians. Here it is 60 years later, and it hasn't changed. And the West continually tries to appease, and they do not succeed. You go through multiple Russian leaders, and the outlook is always the same. And you say, what is it going to take to make you to act civilized? Well, you see their actions in the Ukraine. What is it going to take for people in the world to get pissed off? For 10 million Ukrainians to die? Everyone should feel like this is their responsibility. Not that, oh, let's discuss and see if we can send this or this kind of aid. Put pressure on your politicians, because they're not leaders, they're politicians. okay? Leaders are people like the gentleman who's now in a bunker in Kiev, imploring his people to fight the invading force. That's a leader. Lech Walesa was a leader. He led Poland indirectly to freedom. Biden, he's a politician, but we still have the choice of putting pressure on those people and forcing them to do what's right. And what is right is to support the Ukrainian people. On a smaller scale, what can you do? Try to find out what products are coming into the United States that are from Russia. It's a muddled business. It's a muddled to figure it out. One company that owned up is BP. They said they're going to get rid of their 20% stake in Russian oil. Well, next time you need gas, don't go to BP. Go somewhere else. Do your small part. You're out in the nightclub, you want to have a drink, you want to have vodka, okay. Russian vodka exists. Take Polish vodka. Take Ukrainian vodka. It's a small step, but eventually you're doing your part. The most important thing is get involved, because these people are dying, and they're dying because they just want to be free, and they want to have basic human rights. And this is what it's all about in this world, is basic human rights.
I agree with everything you said, and it's well said. It's up to audience members. It's up to everybody to rile people up and get them motivated. I think with our job is to supply the facts and to give students the information, and then they take it and then they do as you say. So I think we're good with that. Yeah.
And run with it.
Thank you very much. Any other comments or questions? I was going to put up a YouTube video that I saw, the most interesting thing. I told you about it. So there's this Ukrainian citizen driving through the streets of Kyiv, and he encounters a Russian tank, and so he drives and he stops and he asks the soldiers by the tank, he says to them, so what's going on? And he says, they ran out of gas. And he goes, well, can I give you a ride back to Russia? And what was most striking to me about that minute, 30-second video is the Russian soldiers, they started laughing with him. And so it just led me to believe that this is a war among politicians and everyday ordinary citizens, Russian, Ukrainian, they're kind of the same and they want the same things. And I don't see how the Russian army's heart is into it. I just don't, just given the circumstances that we described. But anyway, Jacob has a comment or question. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is just expanding on the idea of being pissed a little bit. Recently, I saw news that a 4th grade girl died due to fire upon their vehicle while moving through Ukraine. I think that's where I went from pissed to angry.
Great comment.
The situation really riles me up, honestly. The fact that that blunt instrument, as mentioned, it really is what the Russian military is, whether that's due to lack of training or what, but their willingness to fire or act on civilian vehicles, which, to be fair, the civilian population in Ukraine is capable of fighting back at this point. They have been supplied with some degree of small arms capability. To what degree they are actually fighting back, I'm not 100% sure. It's not really something to be addressed. It's mostly just
a comment. Okay, I missed the first part.
The human atrocities are terrible, and they're gonna get worse. Thank you so much, everybody.